Did you like him when you first met?
No, I didn't like him at all. There's days he annoys me now.
Paul Stanley seems like he's too chill a guy to hate anybody, but that couldn't be any further from the truth. Just because he's reserved doesn't mean he doesn't harbor hate towards some artists. He's even had some of his bandmates fired over how much he hates them. One artist has never met Stanley, but yet he's hated over what he's heard about him. Here are 8 artists 73-year-old Paul Stanley hated the most. Starting our list at number 8 is someone you wouldn't expect, Gene Simmons. As you know, Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley were really the core that made up Kiss. They both departed from Wicked Lester before recruiting Ace Frehley and Peter Criss to complete the quartet. This meant that the two rock stars shared a bond in a way that they didn't share with any other member of Kiss throughout the band's career. But the beginning of their relationship as band members wasn't the tightest of knits. Stanley actually had doubts about Simmons' music writing skills. Something like this is very hard to hide, and Simmons being ready to go all in, knowing that Stanley didn't have much faith in him, made him feel a type of way. Gene recalls, "I thought we should be in a band together, but Paul didn't like me at all." Stanley also admitted this, but the two managed to overlook their differences and make things work. And to imagine that the world might never have gotten Kiss over this issue is crazy. As much as they overcame this obstacle easily, bigger hurdles were waiting for them ahead in their career. Most diehard Kiss fans know that when it comes to members coming and going, Kiss has lived through eras defined by having different members. Peter Criss was fired, Ace Frehley left, and Eric Carr had to be replaced because he sadly passed away. This made Gene and Paul the only consistent members of the band throughout the decades. But the problem that made Paul start to resent Gene was that he found himself putting more effort into things. During the 80s, Gene Simmons was dabbling his hands into other ventures, and this left Paul with a lot of workload. Paul often found himself struggling to keep the band afloat. Realizing that the one person he felt he could trust was doing him dirty left him feeling betrayed. This betrayal was far more painful than Frehley's departure. Once again, being treated poorly was what brewed the hate that Paul had for Gene. Having to be the bigger person really put Paul Stanley under a lot of emotional stress. It was becoming too much to bear, and what allowed him to find peace was knowing that his goals and what Kiss represented would always be worth the stress, and not achieving them over a few squabbles wasn't worth it. On a podcast with Joe Bonamassa, Paul Stanley detailed his resolve. There was pragmatism involved. You have to prioritize and figure what's most important to you to reach your goal. I knew that Gene and I were much stronger together than me alone. I'm not really sure that he knew that, but that became irrelevant. It was, how do I get where I want to go? How do I achieve what I want? And Gene was essential to it. And here we are 50 plus years later. It's astounding. We've created something that seems like it will outlast us. It's nice to see that they worked out their differences, but Paul Stanley didn't do that with everybody on this list. Especially number 8, Steven Tyler. Aerosmith's Steven Tyler is perhaps one of the few artists with whom Paul Stanley has serious beef. Steven hates Paul with every bone in his body. If these two were ever in a room, it would end up in a Royal Rumble. What makes this even crazier is that Aerosmith and Kiss have gone on tour together on multiple occasions. But in an interview, when Steven Tyler was asked about Kiss, he didn't have kind words. "We were always a band that had something to prove. We always wanted to blow off whatever band it was. It's normal for rock bands to be very competitive. In fact, it can be healthy. But there's a thin line separating it from toxicity, and Kiss and Aerosmith's relationship leaned towards the latter. Because Tyler still had smoke for Paul Stanley and his band, stating, "Kiss is a comic book rock band, and they got a couple hits, but they're more of a comic book. You see them in their spackled faces." While Tyler is all out about his feelings towards Paul, the star child is more passive-aggressive in his hatred for the Aerosmith singer. Maybe Steven's feeling a bit full of himself because he's got an album coming out. Paul Stanley has even gone further to explain why Steven Tyler might feel the way he does. It has to do with when their respective bands were on a joint tour. The profits were split equally, but Tyler always felt a certain way because the audience loved Kiss more. And essentially, Paul Stanley was calling Steven Tyler a liar. Aerosmith never blew Kiss off. The Kiss starman gave his account of things in an interview. "I have to say that seeing him go on after us, to play to an underwhelmed audience and see people walking out, didn't feel too bad to me. Oh, but Stanley's hatred for Steven Tyler runs so deep that he has disdain for other Aerosmith members. And that feeling is very much mutual. That's why number 6 is another Aerosmith member, and that's Joe Perry. The enemy of someone's enemy is their friend, so that makes an enemy's friend a fellow nemesis. That's what describes the feeling of hatred that Paul Stanley has for Aerosmith's Joe Perry. Turns out that this feud is more of a band thing than individual problems. In an interview, Joe Perry said some harsh words about Kiss. It's two different animals. They went the theatrical way and used rock and roll kind of as their soundtrack. And for Aerosmith, the music is our show. It's apples and oranges. The words, aggressive words of spite, didn't just spring from nowhere. There was an incident over 40 years ago that made both Kiss and Aerosmith basically sworn enemies. In 1976, Aerosmith and Kiss were performing at a concert, and their roadies got into a disagreement. But this encounter wouldn't remain as a verbal dispute. It escalated into a knife fight, and the two bands have never seen each other the same since. Although no one was hurt as both parties were separated before things could get messy, it damaged their rapport. The two bands had become sworn enemies bent on never reconciling their differences. Paul Stanley stood his ground for being hated for his musical style, but that's the exact reason why he hates this next person. At number 5, it's Richard Hell. If an unproblematic old rockhead and legend like Paul Stanley dislikes someone's music, it really says a lot about them. And that's exactly the situation between him and Richard Hell with his band, the Voidoids. In an interview with Classic Rock back in 2012, Paul Stanley was asked about the new wave of rock bands, particularly the ones emerging from the iconic New York nightclub CBGBs at the time. He felt it was lackluster and not something to write home about. He stated this: "I went there, but that scene was based more on wanting to express yourself than knowing how to play an instrument well enough." Given the type of career Paul Stanley has had, he really appreciates musicians who put a lot of work and dedication into their craft. However, he does understand the importance of expression through music. He and Kiss were rocking makeup and leather costumes for the first decade of their career. But what really bewilders Paul is bands that put their image first before anything, and to him that's so distasteful, he hates it. And he name-dropped an artist he hates for this exact same reason. There were a lot of artsy bands at CBGB that left me cold, like Richard Hell and the Voidoids, and all that nonsense. A lot of artists and bands are present, yet Paul singling out Richard Hell shows how he feels. He doesn't just despise them, he hates them for their music alone. This is an artist he hasn't interacted with. If Paul Stanley hates you without meeting you, just know your music offends him to the core. If anybody knows anything about receiving harsh criticism, it's Stanley. He's been on the receiving end of some very controversial opinions. No one had a stronger opinion about his band than artist number 4, Dee Snider. The feud began with a small crack that quickly turned into a canyon. Dee Snider, who spent his youth idolizing Kiss, publicly attacked the band's decision to let newer members wear the classic personas, calling the practice insulting and embarrassing. Paul Stanley answered without subtlety. On Chris Jericho's podcast, he said, "Let me put it in the simplest terms. This guy is a wannabe," and added that Snider and his band were a bunch of buffoons. Those words landed like a fist on the table because Stanley was not simply attacking a rival, he was defending what he sees as Kiss' sacred mythology, the blend of image and spectacle the band built over decades. Snider did not back down, instead turning the argument into a theatrical rebuttal. He mocked the idea that Kiss's modern lineup could replace the originals, and he accused Stanley of deflecting from the real issue. Snider's response mixed humor with provocation. He wrote that Stanley was oddly threatened by him and challenged the notion that putting new members into old personas was anything but an insult to fans. Snider's tone was punchy and precise, meant to sting, and it succeeded in making the dispute public and combustible. What lies beneath the insults is a deeper split over values. Stanley treats Kiss as a brand that must remain viable and relevant over time, even if that means replacing players. Snider framed the controversy in terms of authenticity, insisting that heritage should not be cheapened by imitation. That philosophical clash made every barb feel larger than a celebrity spat, because it asked fans to choose what mattered more, preservation of image or allegiance to the original players. The aftermath has been a series of provocative lines and theatrical responses rather than a clean resolution. Snider has at times called Stanley a and Stanley has repeatedly defended Kiss's right to evolve, which kept the story alive in the music press for months. The feud worked because it read like a classic rock drama, two strong personalities guarding incompatible versions of legacy. And for a band like Kiss that has gone through so many roster changes, surely Paul would have butt heads a few times with his crew. That's why artist number 3 is Vinnie Vince. Paul Stanley's contempt for Vinnie Vincent reads like a slow-burning backstage drama. the kind of tension that starts small and then eats the room alive. At first, Vinny arrived as a solution, a virtuoso who could sharpen Kiss's sound after the messy late 70s. He could play rings around most players, and that dazzled everyone, but it also planted the first seeds of discord. The resentment was not about talent alone. It was about control, timing, and trust. When a guitarist repeatedly turns a rehearsed solo into a personal showcase, the show's architecture collapses, and the leaders of the band have to scramble to hold it together. Paul later wrote that Vinny was hell-bent on using every solo as an opportunity to showcase himself. Those long solos became the visible symptom of something deeper. Vinny reportedly refused to sign a formal employment contract. He pushed for money and status in ways that made Paul and Gene uneasy. He allegedly demanded a cut of gross profits and resisted the rules that keep a road machine running. The tipping point came in public. At one Long Beach show, the solo ran so long that Stanley had to cue him to finish, and the two nearly came to blows in the dressing room afterwards. That explosive moment foreshadowed the end of the run and exposed a relationship that had quietly hardened into mutual distrust. The fallout was more than hurt feelings. It became legal and logistical nightmares. Vinny left and later sued and tangled with the band over rights, royalties, and the right to use Kiss-related branding. He later described the period as 20 years of hell, which helps explain why the man retreated from the spotlight for so long. So when the band discussed a final celebration years later, Paul's position was blunt and personal. "That's not someone who I want to celebrate," he said, ruling out Vinny as a guest on the farewell run. In a career built on spectacle and camaraderie, Paul's refusal is a final, public punctuation mark. It confirms that some fissures do not heal, even after time and distance. Artist number 2, Ace Frehley. The animosity between these two former bandmates didn't start with Stanley. It was all just Ace and his outgoing nature. Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons had met Ace at an audition for what would be the newly formed Kiss back in the early 70s. The beginning of their careers was relatively easygoing, and the only problem they really had was trying to juggle their regular jobs with writing music and playing at gigs. When they tasted monumental success with their platinum album Alive, things started to get sour. Ace started hinting at a possible exit from the band. He frequently voiced his frustration and dissatisfaction with the creative direction the band was taking. And when all 4 band members released solo albums, Frehley's album doing exceptionally well was all the sign the spaceman needed that his time with Kiss was over. When he decided to go solo, he made Kiss forfeit both songs and profits. Paul Stanley was absolutely furious about it. He was shocked that with everything they had going on, Ace would feel leaving was the best thing for him. In an interview, Paul Stanley had this to say: "What we had at the beginning was magical. Ace and I played great together, but in my mind, it's a crime what Ace did. He threw away incredible potential and talent." This was where Stanley's hate for Frehley stemmed from. He saw his departure as a betrayal, an act of selfishness. Music-wise, Stanley didn't have anything against Frehley or the way he played. He described Ace's guitar-playing abilities as bright and burning. He's even gone on to state that Frehley's contribution to what Kiss had achieved was truly immeasurable, but seeing how good he was made him hate him more for leaving. However, Stanley, being the more level-headed member of the group, found it within himself to forgive Ace. Over the years, time did heal Stanley's heart, and Kiss was so successful that it made imagining what could have been more bearable as a memory. But at number 1 is someone whom Paul Stanley hates so much that he's never gotten over it to this day. Perhaps there's no one he hates more than the original Catman, Peter Criss. Paul Stanley has gone from feeling hate for his bandmates to feeling sorry. But one person he is still as angry with to this day is Peter Criss, the first member to leave Kiss. Peter didn't just leave Kiss, he was kicked out. His dismissal was a unanimous decision between him, Gene, and Ace. And they didn't even agree on everything. And here's the crazy part. Ace and Gene all had ugly moments with Paul, but they made up and became friends again. But as for Peter, Paul never stopped hating him. In Paul Stanley's book titled Backstage Pass, he wrote about how he felt about his former bandmate Peter. "I don't think Peter has any life. He's always been negative and always maintained an us, against them mentality. I think Peter's life is probably very one-dimensional, uninteresting, unstimulating." Paul Stanley isn't the type of person to just randomly say mean things about someone without having a reason to. And Peter Criss gave the star child plenty of reasons to hate him. The first time Peter really got on Paul's nerves was during a backstage argument, which got so feisty that Peter wanted to attack the other Kiss members with a broken champagne bottle. As wild as this was, it was only really the beginning. During a tour concert performance on December 8, 1979, Paul Stanley signaled for Peter to slow down the tempo. The only problem is that Peter slowed it down too much. This made Paul shout at him to bring it back up, At this point, concertgoers could see their disorganization and lack of chemistry between them. This didn't just happen that fateful night. On different touring nights, Peter would play to a different tempo and pattern, making the whole performance a joke to watch. One time, he literally stopped playing and walked off while Paul was performing a solo song, and this was the last straw. Stanley recalled, "That crossed a line. It's one thing to sabotage things off stage, and God knows he'd done plenty of that, but this was different. This was in front of people who paid to see us." Chris has come out to tell things from his point of view, acknowledging his mistake yet still demanding some courtesy. "I shouldn't have sabotaged that song, but Paul could have easily waited, finished the show, and talked to me about it in the dressing room. I would have taken that fine. But the way he did it was so girly. He had everyone looking at him, admonishing me." As much as Paul Stanley and the other bandmates were tired of having to deal with him, they were still patient. While Paul had to deal with him while performing, most backstage fights were between Peter and Gene. Peter even went as far as throwing drumsticks at the other band members. It's for these reasons that Paul still burns with hate for Peter to this very day. And while he has had problems with other people reconciled, he's not eager to have Peter in his good graces. There you have it, Paul Stanley's list of artists he hates. Who are surprised is on the list? And who are you shocked didn't make it here? Let us know all your thoughts in the comment section. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on videos like this.